Hello, and thank you for the invitation to allow me to be at your conference to speak on behalf of my co authors, Russ Martinelli and Jim Waddell. Together, we wrote the book Leading Global Project Teams. And it's a new challenge for a lot of organizations and project managers, although globalization has been going on for a long time and global projects have been around for a long time. My name's Tim Raschulte. I am a partner in the Program Management Academy, and I am also Chief Learning Officer at Avanta. I'm also a professor at the George Fox University. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak a little bit about globalization and project management within a global world and a global environment. Undeniably, the state of globalization, if you will, is quickly becoming very small. Thomas Friedman and others have described globalization as becoming flatter, creating a more level playing field in which organizations and businesses and sectors of businesses to operate together. It is undeniable to recognize that the globe is getting smaller in terms of the way in which we can work with one another, especially based on technologies as well as just the speed of things. Air travel has certainly made it easier, as I've already mentioned, technology and other ways to collaborate with individuals from not just in other areas of an organization, but literally around the globe. 83% of organizations say that they are going to increase the level of globalization, increase their work on a global scale. And that's part of the equation. It's half of the equation. And I'll get to the other half in just about a minute. But I think this puts some perspective in what it is that I'll speak about today, which is largely going to be how do we overcome the challenges and the barriers of effectively operating on a global scale. But those organizations saying that they're going to increase the globalization or the reach that they have, they're typically going about this in one of three ways. They're looking to increase their globalization and work on a global scale because they want to reduce costs. They want to reduce the costs associated with product development or service delivery, and they see one way in which to do that is to operate on a global scale, especially when it comes to manufacturing of goods and services. Another aspect of why organizations go global, so to speak, is they want to increase the market or the expansion of their services, their sales into more diverse areas around the globe, especially among emerging markets or markets that are already have already emerged and becoming increasingly mature, such as areas in Asia as well as Western Europe as well as America. The third reason organizations are going global, and one of the most important reasons today, is the retention of employees. The need to relocate for employment, especially to areas of Western Europe or the United States, is becoming, not necessary. Countries as well as individual employees are realizing that they can stay within their own country and telecommute to work, or because many organizations are setting up operations on a global scale in many cities and nations around the globe, there's no need to relocate to a specific geographic location. And so many times organizations are having to enable individuals to work remotely in order to retain their employment. And so those are three of the main reasons that globalization continues to expand. And the challenge in front of us is not necessarily understanding that the globe is getting flatter and creating more level of a playing field, but it's how do we overcome the challenges and the barriers to be effective when we operate on a global scale. Because the fact that things are flat and level when it comes to a competitive playing field doesn't mean that it's going to be easy or without challenge to overcome. Quite the opposite, in fact, is what we've found out. Because as I mentioned earlier, and you can see this on slide 9 of the material that I'd sent over, Even though 83% of companies say that they're going to increase their globalization efforts in the coming years, only 18% of companies say that they are ready to actually be successful or claim success when operating on a global scale. And here's one of the reasons why. When we think about the local to global continuum, and this is on slide 10, when you think about the local to global continuum, we can think about a project manager who, let's just say, from the left-hand side of your slide, moving to the right-hand side of your slide. On the left-hand side, comes from a real example from General Electric. One of our colleagues who we interviewed as part of the book talked to us about his role as a project manager in Portland, Oregon. It's on the left-hand side of your screen. In Portland, Oregon, very local, co-located team, very successful. He got a promotion and got promoted. He did relocate in the United States to Texas, larger organization of General Electric. And when he found himself there, he found himself in charge of not only a team still in Portland, but also in California, in Texas, and in New York. Now, it's a distributed team. There's a level of increased complexity with that, but they're still within the same country. You still have some of the same country cultural aspects. You do have to deal with some time constraints because you are across 3 different time zones, but it's only 3 different time zones. You can still manage fairly easily within a 3-hour window if you're on the East Coast or on the West Coast. It's still pretty easy to manage teams in that way. But he did well and he got promoted again. And he found that not only did he have teams still in those areas, but he also had teams in India and China and Switzerland, as well as in Poland. And so it increased the complexity yet again. And so there is this growing complexity. The further you go to a much more distributed teams of individual, your complexity increases. And that becomes a challenge. And so how does one effectively lead global and highly distributed teams to achieve improved business results? That was really the essence of what it was that we were trying to accomplish in the book. And so we investigated and researched a number of professionals that found themselves in that journey or on that journey where they were very successful project managers leading co-located teams. And as they found themselves increasing their span of project and team management, where their teams were now distributed across countries and throughout the same country, we found that there are very significant barriers and challenges. And we, specifically and intentionally separated challenges and barriers. And I think that's what you'll find as I start going through some of this material. Barriers are, imposed by the organization. There are things that are put in place that can become barriers that need to be overcome. Challenges are things that exist because of the nature of distributed teams, international teams. And those challenges need to be understood in order to be overcome. And so the next several slides and over the next 10 minutes or so, I plan to walk through the top 3 barriers and the top 3 challenges and how the best organizations, those that claim success on a globally distributed scale, are currently working through both those barriers and challenges. So organizational structures and performance measures that limit team collaborative dynamics necessary in global markets. That's some of the essence around the around the barriers as we start. Also differences in the culture. Whether it be company culture, the country culture, and the functional culture. There's differences when it comes to culture, and you might realize that if you work within an IT division, the IT division has a different culture dynamic within the team than a team that might be in HR or a team of engineers. And the same holds true if you have a team in the United States. They have a different culture than perhaps a culture of a team that is in Japan or is in Taiwan or is in Switzerland or is in Germany. And so understanding the country culture as well as the company culture, as well as the functional silo of IT versus HR, cultures are different and they need to be understood in order to be overcome. Also, something that really becomes a barrier within organizations is the development model, the project management model that is in play. If there is not a model that supports highly collaborative, interdependent teams, it becomes a barrier. And so that needs to be overcome. And so these are some of the key barriers that we found. And some of the key challenges that we found were communication challenges. Just the difference of context and the approach to communication is different based on countries and based on the way in which this ties in with country culture as well. So communication challenges really become a challenge for individuals managing highly distributed teams. Not only is there a communication challenge by having to use more technology because you don't have the opportunity to run into each other face to face in the office as much, that becomes a challenge in and of itself. But then also understanding the communication styles and the communication processes in different countries becomes a challenge for most project managers. The other challenge, as I've already mentioned, is time zones. When you start working across, a nation like the United States, three different time zones is not too terribly difficult to manage. But when you start working across an entire globe, where in some areas of the globe, there are fractional time zones. There's when you get into certain areas of India and there are half-hour time zones and things aren't on the full hour, it becomes increasingly challenging to work across those time zones. And if you find yourself on a global team and you find yourself having to think about work on a 24-hour schedule because as you sleep, others are actually working, it amplifies the challenge around communication as well, because when you send in an email to somebody, you might get that back the next day or maybe 2 days later rather than within a couple hours. And so the time that it takes to engage in conversation increases the more the time zones that you span. And so that certainly becomes a challenge. And, as illustrated on slide 19, leadership becomes a challenge. How it is that we actually lead individuals is a challenge. And especially if we go from a face-to-face group that's co-located versus a team that is distributed, the way in which we lead, the way in which we communicate, the way in which we work with one another becomes increasingly challenging. So now, how do we overcome these? So we've got a number of barriers that we just reviewed. We've got a number of challenges that we just reviewed. How do we overcome these? Let's start with the barriers. So we talked about organizations that if they don't have a structure in place that fosters collaboration, it becomes a challenge. The more global you go, the more of a barrier that becomes the structure, just the sheer structure of the organization. What we have found is the more organizations move to a global scale, the flatter the organization is, the faster you can actually move through that organization and create products and bring about solutions and provide services and so forth. And so success depends, as it's illustrated there on slide 21, success depends first of all on building effective collaboration between networks of resources. The traditional hierarchy of organizations is not conducive for collaboration. And so the flatter the organization becomes, the faster that organization can move. And especially on a global scale, this becomes important. So best practice number one, flatten the organization structure. Try to increase the amount of collaboration among individuals within the organization. We'll talk a little bit more about how to influence collaboration in some best practices to come. So here's best practice number two. Best practice number two talks specifically about that development model. As you grow and as you expand globally, it's very important to make sure everyone is following the same development model. Whatever type of project lifecycle you use, whatever, if you're in product development or service development or any kind of project that you're currently managing, everyone needs to understand the same development model that's in use. Understanding the life cycle as well as the deliverables within that life cycle, and especially the decision-making processes within that life cycle as well. Now, what we have found is that those that adopt a collaborative development model, need to make sure that they're not following a standard traditional waterfall kind of model. What we have found is the more agile modeling, the anything that avoids the traditional project handoffs, increases probability for success. So the project ownership being handed off to one group to the next in a standard life cycle flow is problematic the more you go onto a global scale. That needs to be replaced with a much more dynamic, agile, iterative based model, like a program development model. If you're familiar with program development, this is where the entire team comes together. They identify the idea, the end state of what they want. They disaggregate that into individual component parts, project parts, that then gets reaggregated at the source of delivery and when it needs to be manufactured to come together into a whole product. That illustration is illustrated on slide 23 of the materials that you have. And so best practice number 2, organizations succeeding often have a program-based development model. It's not a standard waterfall traditional life cycle model. It is something much more dynamic and much more agile. Best practice number 3, change behaviors. Change behaviors by changing the reward system. When people are working collaboratively toward a common set of goals, they can't be rewarded on an individual scale. And so what we have found is as organizations move, like in the General Electric example, when individuals moved from a single co-located project to a national project team to a global project team, you have to change behaviors by changing the rewards that those individuals get. Success is really driven based on a shift from rewarding the individual to rewarding the team. And this becomes a challenge for many organizations because a lot of organizations reward individuals for individual-based work. On a global scale with global level projects, those that change that mindset, change that behavior, change that reward system to more of a team-based reward system, find that they can outpace competitors. That's best practice number 3, change behavior by changing the rewards. Let's now think about the challenges. Now the challenges were around, the time zones and things of that nature. So let's talk a little bit about time zones. First and foremost, best practice when it comes to the challenges, manage effectively across time zones. This starts with, one, being mindful that there are time zones. When you ask people, how many time zones are there? Most individuals are going to say there's 24 time zones. And that's true when you're only counting standard time zones. The reality is there are over 40 time zones in place today because of the number of fractional time zones that are in place. Those that are not always on the full hour but are on half hours. And so it's good to know that there's 24 standard time zones, but if you're working with groups in certain areas of the globe, you have to understand the fractional time zones that make up the 40 plus time zones that we really have in place around the globe. So those that are best in class, best practice when working on global teams, they're very mindful of time zones and they're very intentional about time zones. And what I mean by that, and what Russ and Jim and I wrote about that based on our research, is, the best project managers are mindful of the time zones and they intentionally schedule meetings and schedule times to collaborate and connect with people based on their time zone, not our time zone. So if we're project managers and we are in Los Angeles, it's easy to look at everything on Pacific Standard Time. But if we have teams that are in India working, some of the meetings should be scheduled on their time. Some of the individuals, if we have individuals on our project team from Tokyo, some of the times should be based on Tokyo. And so that we are not always inconveniencing individuals in other areas of the globe that are on our team, that we kind of, share in that pain, so to speak, that, we're not always meeting late at night for somebody or very, very early in the morning for somebody else. but we're intentionally scheduling our time so that everyone contributes and everyone can be comfortable some of the time relative to the project at hand. Best practice number 2, we talked about collaboration as a barrier. Sometimes the structure creates a barrier around that, and we have to overcome that. Sometimes our life cycle creates barriers around that, and we have to overcome that. When we think about challenges, slide 27 talks about overcoming the challenge of collaboration by creating interdependencies, intentionally creating team interdependencies where the teams have to come together to work on a solution. So, best practice number 2 when it comes to challenges, map cross-team interdependencies. Create situations where individuals, whether it be the software team and the hardware team, or the manufacturing team, or the product testing team, that they have to come together to work together on providing solutions and handoffs. That it's not the traditional process of I've conducted my work and I'm throwing it over to the next person. They're going to conduct their work and they're going to throw it to the next person. But we actually come together to collaborate on the solution to make sure that the handoffs are more smooth. So, managing teamwork, co-located teams focus on the completion of tasks. Distributed teams, globally distributed teams especially, have to focus on the completion of deliverables. So, the project team leader, the project manager, should map out cross-team interdependencies around the deliverables, manage to those deliverable dates, and try to establish situations where those teams are coming together, working collaboratively around those deliverables so that there are no surprises when those handoffs are actually made. Best practice number 3 when it comes to challenges, modify the team delivery system. When we think about global teams, it's often referred to, or there's a common comment that time is the enemy. Part of the reason we say that is the example that I provided earlier about email. If I email somebody within my office in Los Angeles, I might get an email response within 2 minutes or maybe 2 hours. If I email my colleague in India, it might take 24 hours for me to get a response. And so the time needed to have a conversation increases. And so time is the enemy of the global project team leader, as illustrated on slide 28. The greater the time between the milestones, the greater risk you take on in the project. And so, as a project manager working on a global team, what you want to be able to do is tighten up the time in which your deliverables are being provided. And so, you might otherwise have a 3-month deliverable, 3 months to go through a testing cycle. Well, to finalize testing, 3 months. What we want to do as project managers, we want to narrow that and say within the first 3 weeks, how do we take the first 3 weeks to have the first results of the testing? And then another 2 weeks for another result, and another 2 weeks for another result, to then build the duration of 3 months necessary. So when we think about a best practice to overcome one of the challenges we have, because time is the enemy, break down the deliverables and modify the team delivery system that they are having to deliver something every 2 or 3 weeks at the most. Ideally, it would be every 1 week or 2 weeks. That's very hard to do within most projects. But a 2-week to a 3-week cycle, most teams should be able to produce meaningful work, big deliverables within that amount of time. So break that work down, conduct that work breakdown structure to a finer level of detail. You don't need to necessarily get involved in the task level, but at the deliverable level, make sure that your teams are delivering something every 2 to 3 weeks so that they're handing something off, so that there's increased collaboration and that there's a faster turnaround cycle within the overall life cycle of the project. So to summarize, best practices summarized. To overcome global barriers, flatten the organization is number 1. Number 2, adopt a collaborative development model. And number 3, change behaviors by changing the reward system. To overcome global challenges, first, be mindful and intentional when it comes to working across time zones. 2, map cross-team interdependencies. And 3, modify the team delivery system so that you are providing increased deliverables more rapidly across the entire life cycle. Now, when we think about that, Those were the top three challenges as well as top three barriers that came from our research. And those were the solutions that came from the practitioners that we interviewed. What we did next was we identified what is the competency model or what are the capabilities that the global team leader, that global project manager needs to be effective. And we looked at this and described this and defined this on slide 30 of your materials. Competencies or one's capabilities is really the additive nature of one's knowledge, their skills, their personal qualities, and their experiences. And so one needs to be knowledgeable about global business and the global challenges and barriers in order to be effective as a global project manager. They need to have skills in order to overcome those barriers and overcome those challenges. They have to have personal qualities that are that initiate action, that intentionally try to build relationships, because it's much more difficult to do so on a global scale, a virtual scale, than it is when you're face to face with individuals. And obviously, experience counts for a lot. The more you can experience global teams and global projects, the more you're going to understand why these barriers and challenges exist and how best to overcome them. So, when we think about that, then, when we think about the competencies, there are a few things that individuals need to be really effective at. To be an effective global team leader, global project manager, you need to have good team leadership. You need to have good virtual management skills. You need to have good global business skills, customer and market skills, as well as, and of course, project management skills. So what do we mean by that? Team leadership skills are really about understanding, the need for leadership and how leadership is differentiated from management. Influencing skills, prioritization skills, systems thinking and systems related skills. Being able to understand the politics that go on within organizations and across organizations, and to be politically savvy becomes increasingly important on a global scale. You have to be good when it comes to virtual management. Cross-culture management skills are certainly important. Virtualization skills, understanding systems and how to leverage systems, technology that is, facilitation and networking skills, emotional intelligence skills, and contextual skills. Understanding context as well as content become very important, and those are all what we refer to as virtual management skills and capabilities. Third is the global business skills and global business acumen, business fundamentals, strategic thinking, as well as having a world view, not just a siloed view within one location or geography within the world, but a global worldview. Customer and market perspectives and capabilities is really about understanding your product and the service that you're offering, the markets in which you're offering those, and what's going on in those markets. What's the socioeconomic systems in the market? What is the political systems in the market? What are your customers' experiences in the market? That becomes extremely important for a global leader. And of course, the project management skills remain important. Understanding projects and process proficiencies, life cycle management, program management, project management, especially stakeholder management and stakeholder communication skills is vitally important. And so that's the competency model. In order to overcome the three main challenges, the three main barriers, we have found that the best individuals that can do that are extremely good when it comes to team leadership, virtual management, global business, customer and market experience and acumen, and project management. So I hope that was helpful. I've enjoyed putting this video together for you. And again, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to your conference. Again, my name is Timur Schulte. I'm a partner within the Program Management Academy and a Chief Learning Officer at Avanta. Thank you. Have a great day.